Hello everyone, and a warm welcome back to the channel for the second episode of my Ships of War series. Now in today's episode I am going to be looking at two potential Cold War antagonists. Luckily for us the balloon never went up, but it may well have done. And in the game Attack Sub, it is possible that these two submarines will be pitted against one another. I speak, of course, of the Soviet Union's Typhoon class, represented here by the Opakov, and the US Navy's Seawolf class, represented here by the lead ship of the class, USS Seawolf herself. Now, as per the arrangement of this series, I'm going to be looking at these vessels in their historical context, trying to gauge their relative strengths and weaknesses to each other, and also, as far as possible, attempt a judgment on how well they are represented in the game in which they feature. So I'll be taking a close look at these two. But I must warn you all from the start, because Attack Sub is set in the very, very recent past, i.e., the late 1980s, the height of the height of the closing period of the Cold War, most accurately. A lot of the information pertaining to these submarines, these really quite remarkable submarines, it's quite hard to find. There's a lot of information out there, but the fine details in many cases are either still classified or not accurately reported. So that is going to have an impact on my ability to comment on these two vessels. There's also the fact that you have to be a bit careful with vessels of any kind that never actually fought each other, because the combination of how recent they are, and plus the fact that thankfully there has not, as far as I'm aware, been actual combat between these submarines or members of their class. A lot of what I say is going to be purely theoretical, but that health warning aside, I will crack on and see how I do. Before I really get into the nitty-gritty of things, those of you who know your submarines well are probably wondering why I have taken an SSN, a nuclear attack submarine, and paired it off against an SSBN, ballistic missile strategic submarine, because they're not ideal foes in that way. Their mission brief is very different. The Soviet vessel's primary job is to lob nuclear warheads at target cities, that sort of thing. That's its main function. The job of the US submarine is to prevent it from doing that. So surely wouldn't it have been a better idea to select the very best Soviet SSN from the stable and pit them against each other? Well, maybe. But the reason I chose Opakov is because as a second generation or improved Typhoon class submarine, she benefits from the very best that Soviet technology has to offer, not just in terms of her ballistic missile capabilities, but also in terms of her ability to fight other submarines. So while it's not her primary purpose, she can, in theory, or at least in the game terms, do it as well as any other submarine out there in the Soviet lineup. And that was what informed my decision to pit her in this comparative exercise against the Seawolf. And before I kick off properly, let's just have a bit of background to these two. I'll start age before beauty with the very impressive Typhoon class. Now, these vessels, we now know, had their genesis in the 1970s. That's when the designs began to come together and the construction was initiated. In the mid-1970s, in response to the US intention, stated intention to develop the Trident program, Chairman Leonid Brezhnev warned President Gerald Ford that the Soviet Union would retaliate, and he name-dropped something called the Typhoon Project. Now, initially, the West was not entirely certain whether Typhoon referred to a new kind of nuclear missile or to a new kind of submarine. As things turned out, the answer was yes to both. And what was being planned were these remarkable submarines. They still hold the record today for being the largest submarines ever created by humankind. I don't know if we'll ever exceed them, but I don't know how economical it would be. The very first one was completed around 1980 and finished its successful sea trials in about 1981, 1982. Initially, it seems the Soviets planned to build at least a dozen of these enormous vessels, but that program was never completed. As far as I'm aware, they built, I think it was about half a dozen. That information may be inaccurate. But nonetheless, the fact that they managed to churn out that number was hugely, hugely impressive. And they were a significant threat strategically to the West, and they gripped the Western imagination in a way that most other Soviet submarines have not done. I think we have Tom Clancy to blame for that in the best possible way. Of course, his novel Hunt for the Red October became a major motion picture. And so this class has entered popular culture in a very interesting way. But I'd just like to say a few words about her layout because it's very interesting in that although the US Navy considered a design where you have the sail aft and most of the submarine's mass forwards, they never really implemented it in practice. It was a bit of a break from previous construction for the Soviets as well. But what you effectively have, and this will be a bit clearer on the data card from the game Attack Sub when I get onto that, but forward of the sail, you have her enormous battery of 20 launchers for the SSN 20 nuclear missiles. She, of course, has her torpedo room forwards as well, reactors further aft, and the twin screws, which are out of the picture here. Fair amount of space. It's a very capacious vessel, double hulled, which gives her a great deal of structural strength. And so really quite a lot to recommend her. Certainly a lot of wow factor. Now by comparison, her rival, this is a rather nice picture of USS Seawolf running on the surface, is not such a large submarine. In fact, the Seawolf is not significantly larger than the Los Angeles class submarines, which she succeeded. I mean, the Los Angeles class are still very much out there, but Seawolf here was meant to be the start of the next generation, improving upon those. In appearance, she's a much more conventional nuclear attack submarine following the US design pattern. She does have that rather interesting slope on her sail. So these submarines, they were first conceived in the late 1980s, so quite some distance behind the Typhoon class. In fact, I think they were formally authorized under the 1988 or the 1989 program, and Seawolf herself did not actually complete for service until I'll say the mid-1990s. I may be a bit off with that one. Interestingly enough, although they still represent very good naval tech, all of the Typhoon class are presently, as far as I'm aware, out of commission and in reserve. But there is the vague possibility they may be activated as long as they've been looked after properly. Seawolf herself, despite a lifespan of a couple of decades, is still in service, which is very impressive. But she is being surpassed by the US Navy's even more formidable and brand new Virginia-class submarine. So awesome and world-killing though she is very soon going to find herself in second place if she's not there already. So how are these craft represented in Attack Sub? Well, I am quite impressed that the statistics were compiled as successfully as they were. I'm going to come straight out and say that because, bit of a spoiler alert, I think these two have been quite accurately modelled, especially given the limited information that was available to game designers at the time. So Attack Sub was crafted in the 1990s, which is quite incredible when you think that Seawolf was only barely entering service and the Typhoons were still incredibly secret. And the designer wouldn't have had access to super secret information. I mean, this stuff was still cutting edge. There's no way anyone would let a game designer get at it. So the usual sources were probably consulted by way of publications like Jane's Defense Weekly, various naval publications and reference works, like the Combat Fleet series was quite a useful one. But it only gives you the basics. But that being said, as far as I've been able to determine, the weapons that both craft are credited with and their capabilities are as well modelled as can be and probably are completely accurate. So with that assurance and possibly laying myself open to criticism that I'd got this wrong, let's have a look at how they line up next to each other. Now, the first thing you'd notice is the enormous disparity in size. Looking at Opakov's displacement, she displaces 30,000 tons. Now, that's her submerged displacement. Some sources dispute this and say upper 20,000s, but to be honest, that's pretty impressive. 9,150 is the Seawolf's submerged displacement, and that's quite accurate. So the Seawolf is much, much smaller than the Opakov. Now, when it comes to submarine warfare, I'm going to hold these together because it's cool. The drawings are to scale. You can see what a monster the Typhoon class is. Point of interest before I carry on. Typhoon was, of course, the Soviet designation originally. NATO called these the Sierra class for a while, but for some reason Typhoon has stuck in both east and west. But anyway, size. Size is not necessarily an advantage when it comes to submarine warfare. When this class first came to NATO's notice in a big way, there was some genuine concern that her double hull, very strong structure and tonnage would allow her to shrug off hits from existing US anti-submarine warfare weapons. In particular, there was a fear that the Mark 46 torpedo, which was the submarine torpedo available in the 1970s and early 1980s, I think, would be ineffective against this thing. You'd need a lot of hits to sink it. And that may well have been the Soviet idea, but it doesn't really hold much water, because the great problem for any submarine that takes a hit in the modern era is that weaponry in the late 20th century was very, very destructive. And even if it failed to sink a monster like this, it could very easily cripple it. Even a near miss that staves in a lot of hull plating will cause flooding. It will generate noise. The shock of the impact is going to affect systems all over the vessel. So you probably lose your main power. You probably don't want to think about what the impact has done to your reactors. And your delicate computer systems run the risk of going offline. Your sonars will be affected. There's a lot of fragile stuff in the submarines of every nationality, and a hit is simply bad news. That said, there may well have been something to the sub's survivability, albeit, in a crippled state. And that is why in the game, the hull boxes here, you can see with damage, the submarine's capability drops rapidly, but all being well, she's a very difficult sub to sink. Somewhat more difficult than the Seawolf, and I think that's right. I've commented in my review of Attack Sub that some of these survivability tracks, or damage tracks, if I could call them that, are a bit on the optimistic side in that, 9 times out of 10 a properly functioning torpedo or anti-submarine missile warhead should kill these things at one go. But it does add a bit more tension and excitement to the game. So I have no argument with the Opakov being harder to get rid of than the Seawolf. So moving on, let's look at the sensor systems if we move down the card. Now, I couldn't find very much detailed information about Soviet era sonar equipment. There are some sources that give you their designation, but it's not really that helpful. There's a ton of published material about their older Hercules and Phoenix sonar systems, but those equipped their much older nuclear submarines, and it's generally known that they had much better low frequency passive arrays and quite decent active arrays when they wanted them on their latter generations of nuclear submarines. That said, they always lagged behind the West. It's a lot easier to find information on Western systems, but again, you have the problem that not that much detail is given about them for very sensible reasons. A lot of the equipment on the Seawolf, for example, is still very current, so you wouldn't want to give away the specifics of that. Broadly speaking, Soviet sonar technology lagged behind the West, certainly through the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. So I think it's reasonable to assume, based on the little that we know about detection systems, or at least the specifics, to give the Typhoon class a sensor value of 3, because that's the best you get in the Soviet side in this game. Comparatively, the Los Angeles and the British Trafalgar classes have a sensor rating of 5, reflecting the West's superior technology in this area. And that includes the towed arrays used by the Los Angeles class. Your sonar's not built into the hull. You actually have the capacity to tow it behind you to eliminate interference from propeller noise. It's not certain if the Soviet submarines of the 1980s had an equivalent to this technology, because that was one of their great problems, that for the most part the Soviets never seemed to have got away from hull-mounted sonar, whereas the West had already broken that. So I think the rating of 6 for the Seawolf is based upon the fact that not only does the Seawolf benefit from these better detection systems overall, but being a generational advance over the Los Angeles class, their systems would be even better. I think that is a reasonable assumption to make. So I will go with that. I will agree that a rating of 6 to the Soviet 3 is fairly spot on. We can be a tiny bit more confident about weapon systems because, again, it's difficult to find accurate information about what the two sides had. But looking at sources like Jane's publications and Combat Fleets, particularly the 1988-1989 volume, there is confirmation there that the armaments as given for both vessels is broadly correct. In fact, it's accurate for the Soviets. And as it's turned out, what you see here is what the Seawolf had. So let's deal with the Soviets first, because they have a attack rating of +2, and the Seawolf has an attack value of +4, which is really quite impressive. I'm not going to bother talking about the SSN-20 ballistic missiles because those weapons are of absolutely no use in a submarine-to-submarine battle. So I'm going to discount them. What's more important are the 533mm torpedo tubes, of which the Typhoon had 6. Now, these are capable of launching either the standard Soviet 533mm torpedo or the SSN 15 and 16 missile. Now, Soviet weaponry at this time also lagged behind the United States, but I've got some good things to say about their torpedoes. The Soviet Navy's 533 millimeter torpedo was a very, oh, sorry, and I think it is still in service, is a very reliable weapon. It has a range of about 54 nautical miles if you set it for 30 knots. This reduces to 22 nautical miles if you set it for its maximum speed of 45 knots. But I mean, that is quite respectable for a torpedo. It also has limited guidance systems. The very earliest models that were self-guiding used a kind of primitive wake-homing sonar. And throughout the 1980s, the Soviet Union continually refined the design to make them better. But unfortunately, they are prone to being fooled by countermeasures. So very advanced countermeasures can easily throw off a torpedo, which is relying on wake homing. I would imagine that in the present day, Russia has something a lot better, but in the period represented by this game, the mid to late 1980s, most of them were probably still using the wake homing sensors. The SSN 15 and 16 missiles were quite good for the period, but in Soviet service they were broadly restricted to attacking surface vessels. So in a submarine to submarine battle, these missiles would be useless. Very good for striking surface task forces, as I say. If it's helpful, think of them as being a somewhat poorer sister to the US Tomahawk. That will give you the general concept. But had Opakov and Seawolf ever met in battle, then the Soviets would have been forced to rely entirely on their torpedoes. Now, Seawolf, interestingly enough, both the West and the East seem to have settled on the 533 millimeter as a decent standard torpedo size, or torpedo tube system. Now you look at Seawolf's armament. Of course, she has no ballistic missiles. As I say, that's not her function. But she has a good selection of weapons to use in her torpedo tubes. And the card mentions the Sea Lance, the Tomahawk and Harpoon missiles, the Mark 48 ADCAP torpedoes, and mines. Now I'm going to go through these one at a time. The Tomahawk and the Harpoon are very well known in the present day, and they haven't evolved all that much since the 1980s, early 90s, except that their guidance systems have become much better and much more foolproof. So the great advantage of the Tomahawk and the Harpoon is that you can launch it, and in theory you can guide it almost to target, or you can switch it over to local control and allow it to do its own thing. Very impressive piece of kit. But neither of these missiles are all that much good in a submarine battle. They're mostly for killing ground targets and surface ships, a bit like the Soviet SS-15s and 16s. However, the Sea Lance is a slightly different kettle of fish. This is another torpedo that, another missile, and I'll hold this properly so we can still see the sub and stay on the list of weaponry. The Sea Lance is an older piece of ordnance, but it's a very clever missile in that its job was anti-submarine warfare. So these things could be launched from the Los Angeles class submarines. They were initially built for that class, designed and built for that class. And they could be fired from nearly all the way down at that class's maximum operating depth. So you didn't actually need to be close to the surface to fire this missile through your torpedo tube. It's really, really quite amazing. And once these missiles got to their target, they would then be able to engage it effectively, I think, closing in and almost turning into a torpedo or dropping one. But the impressive thing about this is that they came with inertial flight guidance and they had a range of 106 nautical miles. Now, I haven't looked this up. I'm assuming the Sea Lance is still in US Navy service today because it's a very impressive piece of kit. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. I can also say a bit more about US torpedoes because these are much, much better than their Soviet counterparts were. The 1980s saw the introduction of the Mark 48, which was a hugely capable torpedo, I believe still in service in modified form, and a worthy successor to the older Type 46, or Mark 46, I should say. So the Mark 48, I think, went through 3 or 4 iterations by the late 1980s, but the version they've got here, ADCAP. ADCAP stands for Added Capability. And these torpedoes can be launched with their own active or passive or acoustic guidance systems. Or, if you need or want to, they can be launched with a wire guidance system. So the parent submarine can physically guide the torpedo using their own sonar systems for information and target data until they wish to cut it loose. So you've got a much better chance of hitting with all that in the warhead's favor. And I think a lot of that accounts for why the US gets such a better rating than the Soviets. What about its actual characteristics? So I rattled off some figures for speed and range for the Soviet torpedoes. The Mark 48 ADCAP has a very high speed. It has a range of 27 nautical miles if you set it for its maximum, for a speed of 40 knots. But its actual maximum speed, you can crank it up to 55 knots, which is very, very impressive. And of course, in terms of warhead, it's possibly similar to the Soviet model in terms of destructive power, but unfortunately I wasn't able to find any data on the size of the warhead for the Soviet torpedoes. So unfortunately I can, to use a hackneyed Cold War phrase, I can neither confirm nor deny. But in effect, the weapons are equal. And what gives the US its significant edge is their advantage in guidance systems. Now, lastly, I'm just going to briefly linger on the subject of how quiet these submarines are. Now, of course, the Soviets in the 70s had already begun to crack the secret of special coatings for their hulls that could absorb sonar emissions. And so it stands to reason that an improved Typhoon would come absolutely slathered in this stuff. And that accounts for the extra no attack box on their contact level. The USS Seawolf benefits from similar quieting. In fact, the 1980s specification for this submarine required that it be capable of running completely silent and pretty much undetectable even at 20 knots. So this is reflected in the game by the fact that the Seawolf also has 2 no attack boxes. And if you look at their current detection value, they're both rated a 7, which is as quiet as it gets in attack sub. These are very hard submarines to find. So I think that's pretty much all I can say by way of comparison. Does the game reflect them fairly? I've already given you my answer. I think it's a yes. It's problematic because because there's still an awful lot that we don't know for sure about these ships. They're too recent. A lot of what's involved in their operation and their design and their equipment is still classified, or at least the really nitty-gritty details are still classified. So really, I've got to say all kudos to the game designer for getting it as right as possible. I've just realised I forgot to mention something. This is the problem with fine print. If you look very closely under the attack value, you'll see that there is no contact increase for weapon lock-on. Now, what that means, in the game, if a submarine launches a weapon at another or at a surface ship, the defending player can play a passive sonar card to immediately detect the point of origin of that attack. So, in normal circumstances, if a US submarine, not this one, fired at the Opakov, she could play one of those passive cards and immediately get an improved contact. With this, you can't. And this was part of the Seawolf's design requirement that with her new torpedo tubes, she had an improved swim out system for torpedoes that was much quieter than anything the US Navy possessed before. What that meant in practice was that the target submarine would probably detect the incoming torpedo once it went active and went looking for it, or you could hear it traveling through the water, but you would not be able to pinpoint the location of the submarine that launched it, i.e. the Seawolf. And that actually brings me nicely to the final point I wanted to consider, which was how well would these two do against each other in combat. I think I would say, given how my last game went, if you all want to see the video, it's the latest one on my attack sub playlist. One can never take these things for granted. In attack sub, a significant technological edge does not guarantee you victory. But I would say overall, and everything being equal, the odds are heavily weighted towards the Seawolf. Her sensor and detection package is twice as good as her Soviet counterpart. Her attack values represent weapon systems that are far more capable. And just to really add insult to injury, the Soviets can't even benefit from being able to detect an attacking submarine if it's the Seawolf. The Seawolf is every bit as quiet, and really there's nothing to choose between the two in terms of electronic countermeasures. And although speed doesn't have a huge impact in this game unless you're one of the Alpha class high-speed submarines, while the Opakov, this representative of the Typhoon class, is credited with a maximum speed of 30 knots, which is probably a bit kind, really. I don't know if the Typhoons could really attain that underwater. The Seawolf was designed to be a fast submarine, and now that she's been in service a few years, or a couple of decades really, it's been proven that she can actually attain her design speed, which is pushing towards the 34, 35 knots. So she is faster. It's not surprising given the relative mass of the two submarines. The Typhoons have a bigger power plant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's that much more efficient than the US one. So I'll leave it at that. If you want to use these two submarines in a battle scenario with attack sub, by all means go for it. You'd be pitting the best of one side against the other. But maybe to make things fair for the Soviets, you might want to include a couple of escorts for the Opakov, whether that's a surface battle group supporting her, or maybe, if you want to make things very interesting, a couple of Victor 3s, or perhaps even, if you want to push the fast boys out, a couple of Alpha class attack submarines, just to give it that balance so that the US player is kept on their toes. Because I think if you put them against each other on their own, most of the time the Opakov would come to grief and the Seawolf would come home smiling. But I'll leave that there. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope this has proven a worthy successor to its previous episode. I'm sorry that there was less I could say for definite about these two ships, but as I've said a number of times in this video, they are still relative unknowns. We know the basics. There is a lot of information out there, but there's also a lot of misinformation. So you have to be a bit careful about what you choose and what you say. But I very much enjoyed putting this together, and I really hope you found it interesting and enjoyed it too. As ever, comments, queries, corrections are always welcome. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. And if you all continue to enjoy this series, I will begin planning ahead to pick on some other hapless warships or submarines to feature in episode 3. But in the meantime, thank you all very much for following the channel. I really appreciate your company. And as ever, thanks for tuning in. Until the next video, bye.